Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. This video is one I have planned to do for literally more than half a year. I've been thinking about it and rethinking it and thinking about what I should talk about and how I should talk about it. Let's just say that I've filmed this video many times and not released it. So hopefully this time's the charm. Now, if you, like me, live in North America, or primarily the US and Canada, then you've probably seen a lot of headlines that go something like, COVID is the end of transit. Transit empty as COVID ravages North America. Is COVID the end of transit? Things like this. You know, COVID is gut-punching transit, and transit will never recover, right? Well, let's talk about that. And I'm going to talk about why COVID could potentially be a positive transformational force for public transit. If you're not already, consider following me on Twitter, handle will be somewhere around here, as well as joining the community Discord, following us on Instagram, and consider supporting us on Patreon for special extras, and to support us in making videos like the one you're watching here. The first thing I need to do is preface this whole discussion with the whole, apocalyptic predictions for transit discussion seems to be primarily happening in North America, where our transit isn't all that good and where there's a lot of special interests who'd probably be interested in keeping it that way. To be fair, we're also not managing COVID very well. In places that are managing COVID very well, people are riding the trains, getting on the bus every day, going and seeing movies, etc., and they're not all that concerned that the world is ending, especially with regard to public transit. Now, with all that in mind, it's kind of difficult to square this whole everything's normal group of people with the world is ending group of people. Because, let's be honest, there are going to be some substantial changes after COVID is in the rearview mirror. Car references are always painful for me. A lot of major CEOs, not only those from tech companies, but from a broader range of companies across many sectors, have said office workers probably won't be coming in quite as often. A lot of people will be working from home some number of days per week and going into the office for the other days. On the whole, a lot less people need to be going into the office on a daily basis. And from this, transit agencies have an opportunity to make some positive changes that will transform the way they can provide transit for their cities and regions and improve access to millions of people. Now, to be clear, not everyone will benefit equally. If you weren't really running any buses before the pandemic, well, I'm not sure you're going to benefit your transit network that much from reducing the few people that might have been riding those buses, since usually the lowest hanging fruit market is the 9-to-5 commuter market. Basically, if you weren't running many buses or trains beforehand, well, you don't have that many buses or trains to reorganize, so your ability to transfer and change around your network is just not that high. If you're a city like Toronto with great suburban service and a lot of regional and suburban projects in general going forward at the moment, then you have a lot of opportunity to positively impact your network. Cities like San Francisco, Washington DC, and New York City all have a lot of opportunity as well. I'm going to try to break down this whole discussion into a few primary points, or pillars you could say. One thing I hope to see is a move from capacity to coverage. Right now, a lot of money is being spent in the successful transit systems, like Toronto's, on increasing capacity. While this does sometimes serve more customers in general, if you're already riding transit, then you might just ride transit a little less, or you might ride transit at a different time if there isn't enough capacity. On the whole, projects that increase capacity aren't very efficient. If, for example, we didn't need to relieve other subway services, we could just focus on adding coverage. We wouldn't necessarily have to use large trains on every new line we construct. The issue too with building up this massive peak capacity is that you only need it during the peak. If you're building a massive station and it's only going to be utilized fully for maybe an hour or less a day, well, that's not very efficient. And for the rest of the day, your massive station sits massively underutilized, meaning that you spend a ton of money for very little benefit outside of this narrow portion of the day. Well, if you can get a ton of people riding during the peak hours, this is not the worst way of spending your money. If the 9-to-5 commute goes the way of the dodo, then it is problematic. So in a future where the peak hour transportation market is not nearly as important, the smarter way of spending money is probably to invest in coverage rather than capacity. If Toronto stopped building large subway projects and capacity expansions, the large train style ones, extensions are okay, but let's just say that all of our new lines, we cut down the size of trains, we provide the core bare bones service, and we cut all of the major station capacity improvements. We'd have billions on the table. And if we learn to build efficiently by changing metro-style services into something more like the Canada Line, and turning regional-style services into something like a tram train, well, we could build a massive number of new rail lines with the money saved on major subway expansions. By my estimation, at a minimum, you could grow Toronto's rail network by 30+% just by reorganizing funds away from major subway projects to more efficient uses of those funds, still rail projects though. Putting these rail services closer to a lot of people would have some major benefits. Of course, the model of feeding rail with buses is valuable, but a lot of Toronto's suburbs don't have any sort of rail access. Improving the rail grid, so to speak, would allow a lot more people to access that convenient bus-to-train transfer, as well as trips that only use the train. Of course though, as I mentioned, you have to build smarter. If we're building everything with way more capacity than we need and larger trains, then that money is squandered, sort of how it is right now. It makes sense if you need it for the peak hour demand, and a line like the Relief/Ontario line probably still makes sense since downtown Toronto will still always be a big hub, but future expansions need to take this into consideration. The next major pillar is from frequency to service. Now, there are automated systems out there, like SkyTrain, which I obviously like a lot, where operating more service is really not that expensive. It's the cost of electricity and a bit more aerodynamic drag. And for systems where increasing your service frequency is easy, then you should probably do so. The issue is that if increasing your service frequency is easy, you probably already did it, as Vancouver has. Now, while some systems that are automated operate this way, traditional rail and buses don't. And while frequency is great, it really does have a diminishing return effect. A lot of cities operate really frequent bus services, primarily in peak, but not always. It's not uncommon to see buses operating every 3 minutes or so on some of the busiest bus routes. The truth is, though, that if you're able to shift this service around to balance things out, one 3-minute frequency route can turn into 3 10-minute frequency routes with some extra buses around to spare and kind of move around in the network. The same can be said for a 5-minute service frequency, which is also quite common. For one 5-minute frequency route, you can also get 2 10-minute frequency routes. And since 10 minutes is more frequent than many people consider to be frequent enough, if you push it to 15-minute frequencies on the kind of grid network, then you can get even more service coverage than with a 10-minute network. Simply transitioning some of the busiest routes to high-capacity but lower frequency routes could expand coverage in a city like Toronto from this to this. To be clear, 15 and 10-minute routes are still relatively frequent and convenient, and it's not necessarily the case that every route has to run less frequently. When you determine what the new core travel patterns are, trunk routes can get more frequency as needed, but you should try to utilize your buses very efficiently. As you can see, moving away from peaky travel patterns allows for a lot of increases in efficiency. This means you can take your existing transit budget and go so much further in providing high quality service. Now, this does mean you need to push away any budget cuts. I'm not too worried about that in Canada, but in the United States I can't say the same. So what does this all mean? Well, we can provide high-quality Toronto-style suburban bus services in far more places in North America. Now remember, the majority of North Americans do live in suburbs, so this is a massive underserved market for transit. We may no longer need massive capacity to single points in CBDs and downtown cores. Instead, we need meshes or grids or polycentric networks. Now, some systems like the DC Metro and Vancouver SkyTrain are already somewhat polycentric in their nature, and they'll benefit even more from this by being sort of ahead of the curve. Moving to a more polycentric model has another major benefit, which is that you kind of naturally fill out your counter-peak capacity. Normally, when you're operating a very peaky service, you have to operate your vehicles into the core areas full, and then you operate them back out, mostly empty. The issue with this is that a lot of your capacity, which is going back out of the core, is not utilized. Say you have multiple nodes though, people are going to be traveling in every which direction, which means that your trains or buses can be full much more often. This allows for massive improvements in efficiency because in many cases you can double your capacity with the same set of vehicles. This also goes and expands the demand for regional rail. Once you have high-quality bus services, having high-quality and relatively frequent trunks with high capacity is very valuable. I also think that it's kind of valuable to introduce some rural transit services. They don't necessarily have to be frequent, but they can serve areas even further beyond the suburbs with relatively low-frequency services. But as we know, we can easily find more service hours based on reorganizing bus networks. These infrequent regional services can be timed such that they allow people in rural communities to get onto frequent high-quality regional rail quite easily. And since we'd be investing in regional rail, we have an improved rail network to work with, at least in core areas, which means that we should improve service frequencies on lesser used intercity routes between urban areas to at least 4 trips a day. I think this is a good balance because it allows people to easily travel every few hours during the day, depending on when they decide to make a trip. Now, a lot of intercity travel is pre-planned, but allowing people flexibility makes it way easier for them to choose transit. Of course, those timed buses also become very helpful, because not only does the bus feed into stations, but they feed out. So when people arrive from a trip, they can easily get to their final destination, even in many rural areas using public transit. Now, in North America, there are some nearly ubiquitous thrice or twice weekly train services which operate long distances. In Canada, that's known as the Canadian, operating between Toronto and Vancouver 3 times a week. Now, these services are often terribly delayed. I'm talking multiple days of delay, or 30 hours of delay. It's crazy. And what needs to happen here is we need to increase frequency to, I would say, daily at a minimum for long distance trips, so that people can always get a trip that current day to go somewhere else far away, and increase frequency on core corridors. For example, there's no reason that Edmonton shouldn't have more frequent services to surrounding cities because it is a major urban area. There's obviously benefits to kind of coalescing multiple services on one corridor as well. It allows for more connecting trips and more convenience overall. Of course, reduced frequencies are both a blessing and a curse. Often you'll find that we run very high frequencies in urban areas to make up for our poor line management. Basically, we struggle to keep buses consistently a certain number of minutes apart, and so we have to run them more frequently to guarantee a minimum level of service. In Toronto, that's 10 minutes. We need to provide infrastructure and timetables that put far more emphasis on getting to a certain location on time. Now, padding is bad, so we need to avoid going too far in that direction, basically adding so much time to a timetable that trips have to stop at many stops just so that they maintain the timetable if they're ahead of time, as well as investing in infrastructure like bus lanes and signal priority where they make sense and where buses are frequently delayed. This should be a data-driven process. What you'll often find is that a really poorly run 3 or 5 minute service doesn't actually function that much better than a 10-minute service that's timetabled very precisely. This is why transit in Switzerland, for example, operates so well despite frequencies not necessarily being that high, often every 15 or 30 minutes. It's because they're precisely timetabled, so connections are always seamless and trip times are quite consistent. I'll probably make another video on this later, but consistency is often more important than frequency, especially as you move to lower frequencies overall. Of course, there's another major efficiency that can be found here, which is that you only need to build your infrastructure to the minimum level to get your service frequency and travel time requirements. So if you have a train line that only needs to operate every 30 minutes, there's no reason that it can't be single-tracked for a lot of its distance. You just need to plan your passing tracks so that they're in the right place at the right time. There has never been a better time to reshape transit in North America. We can reinvent our transit networks and come out of the pandemic stronger than ever. The pandemic is actually a perfect opportunity to reshape travel patterns, as many people will be going back to work and they'll be willing to try new things. This doesn't have to be a bad thing. This can be a major leap forward for North American transit. Thanks.